Winemakers face a range of daunting challenges from drought and smoke to frost and hail, and of course, fungus, rot, and pests. But for centuries, perhaps the single most intractable challenge facing winemakers has been the loss of desirable aromas during and after fermentation. All that care and effort and money that go into creating an excellent wine is severely undercut when the very aroma compounds that tasters and consumers are looking for and value literally go into the atmosphere right along with vented CO2, never to return. For centuries, attempts have been made to do something about this, from cold fermentation to adding nutrients to condensation techniques, but a consistently effective, low-cost, simple solution has eluded the industry. That is, until now. Which leads me to introduce you to the founder and president of AromaLoc Inc., Dr. Richard Dick Jones. Dick?
Well, thank you, Randy. I'll just share my screen with you and start this. So my name is Dick Jones. I invented the AromaLoc method to preserve volatile aromas that normally are lost during wine fermentation. It was invented here in Naramata, and the company called AromaLoc is based out of Penticton, BC. Why are wine aromatics so important? Well, if you read any scientific paper that's published on the topic, you'll see statements like I show here. As far as consumers are concerned, the aroma and flavor of wine are among the main characteristics that determine its quality and value. Wine aroma is one of the principal attributes determining consumer preference. And finally, winemaking techniques that would function to improve the profile of desirable volatile compounds would be beneficial in the creation of high quality wines. This is, these are statements that kind of showcase the importance of aromas. And the last one kind of said, boy, if we could come up with a method to preserve those aromas, it would be good for making higher quality wine. Just as a short review, let's have 2 beakers partially filled with water and add some aroma compounds to each one. In beaker A, the aroma compound maybe has 30 units of concentration in the water. And after a period with the lid on the beaker, the aroma concentration in the airspace above the liquid is 1. So that has a gas to liquid ratio of 1 to 30. In beaker B, a different aroma compound is added, and after a period for equilibration, we still have 30 units of concentration in the liquid, but there are now 6 units in the airspace above the liquid. So the gas to liquid ratio is much higher in beaker B. We tend to call beaker A aroma compound a hydrophilic aroma because it likes to stay in the water. In beaker B, that aroma compound is described as hydrophobic. Generally, hydrophilic compounds have low volatility and hydrophobic compounds have high volatility. Now there's a term that's used to describe this, and it's called log P. It's a chemical property of a volatile compound that tells how volatile it is, and you'll see that later in the presentation on a graph. So when we sniff the air above a glass of wine, any volatile aromas that are in that air, of course, get dragged by the inhaled air up into the nasal epithelium. There they elicit some kind of a reaction that reminds us of what that aroma compound smells like. And maybe in this case, it's isoamyl acetate, which smells like bananas. You notice that when we inhaled that aroma compound, another one left the wine to enter the headspace. So that's an ongoing thing. Now there's another compound, a blue one in the wine that isn't in the headspace of the glass. And that would be a hydrophilic aroma compound. It's not very volatile. We never would know it's there because we can't detect it. So what is the problem we're dealing with in AromaLoc? So here I show a tank of fermenting wine that is early in fermentation. And on the graph below, I show the CO2 production by the black line, and on the blue line is the level of one of the aroma compounds that are thought to be important in wine, ethyl hexanoate. And you can see that the ethyl hexanoate kind of lags behind the CO2 production, but eventually reaches some level. And the blue line in this graph is the amount of that compound produced. Now, of course, the ethyl hexanoate in the liquid is volatile, and it will tend to go to the headspace. And once in the headspace, the amount of CO2 that's being produced will push that ethyl hexanoate out of the headspace and into the winery. The end result is the amount of ethyl hexanoate retained in the liquid is not as high as the amount produced. And the difference, in other words, the loss of that compound is caused by a thing called carbon dioxide stripping. So no matter how good a winemaker you are, you can't prevent this. Volatile compounds are blown away by CO2. Now, so at the end of fermentation, you have some wine that's been fermented. It has less aroma than was produced because of CO2 stripping. That's not the end of the story. Everything we do to the wine after fermentation adds to the loss of aromas. When we rack, when we fine, when we filter, when we bottle, when we store the wine before a consumer drinks it, all these steps have potential to decrease the aromas. Now, there's some recent information in the literature that shows that these losses are quite significant. The end result is the consumer drinks wine that's down over on the lower right-hand side of the graph. Its aroma concentration is much below the potential. So how are we going to tackle this? Well, AromaLoc is a method that does not touch the wine. It's totally non-invasive. All we do is play with the headspace. Here we have a fermenting wine with the green area, the headspace above the wine. As the CO2 is produced, of course, it has to escape somehow. And what we have is a machine sitting at the tank outlet that ducts the air, or gas, I should say, from the headspace to a membrane. Now, this is a special membrane that is permeable to the aroma compounds. In the inset graph, I show the blue bar being the amount of ethyl hexanoate going to the membrane. Now, as that gas goes past the membrane, a lot of it goes across the membrane with the aid of a vacuum pump and is pumped back to the headspace. You see, in this study conducted at Okanagan College here in Penticton, that that's quite concentrated in aroma. Now that goes back to the headspace. And so what we're doing is taking the aromas normally leaving, putting them back into the headspace in a concentrated form to increase headspace aroma concentration. Now, of course, some aromas will not go across the membrane. Some will escape, and the red bar shows that, in this case for ethyl hexanoate. So we might lose a little bit, but not too much. So what does increasing headspace concentration do? Well, remember, the little yeast are still there working away and producing CO2, and they're producing ethanol, and they're also producing aroma compounds. Now, because in this example, ethyl hexanoate is highly concentrated in the headspace, the ethyl hexanoate produced in the wine, which normally would want to go to the headspace, goes up and says, wow, that's too high a concentration, I'll just stay here. It's a hydrophobic compound, is perfectly happy being in the wine. So the end result is Going back to our previous graph, AromaLoc improves the amount of ethyl hexanoate retained in the wine and relatively little is lost. And the end result after you finish the wine is a wine that has more aroma for the consumer to enjoy. Which aromas are preserved by AromaLoc? Because this is a concern of many winemakers to say, well, I don't want all these fusel alcohol aromas and other so-called bad aromas from being concentrated. Well, this is a graph that shows that value I mentioned earlier called log P. It's a measure of the hydrophobicity of aroma compounds. And on this graph, there are about 20 different aroma compounds shown. And on the y-axis, the up and down, is the change in that wine produced by AromaLoc compared to a matched control wine sitting right next to it. So values above 0 indicate the aroma concentrations for these compounds in AromaLoc treated wine are higher than in control. If you're below the line of 0, then the AromaLoc wine had lower concentrations of that aroma compared to the control. And you can see the values, having low values for log P, the so-called hydrophilic compounds, are not very well preserved. In fact, maybe even lost to some degree by AromaLoc treatment. Whereas the hydrophobic aromas, those are the esters, both acetate and ethyl esters and some other aromatic, highly volatile compounds are preserved by AromaLoc. So this tips the balance of the aroma profile in favor of the hydrophobic compounds, and generally those are the fruity smelling, fruity tasting aromas. And how does that compare to taste? Well, this is one example, but it's an expert, a master of wine, who rated an AromaLoc wine versus a control. The control is shown by the red line, and that's 0 all around. So any point outside that red line represents AromaLoc was higher than the control. And you can see that for all the 7 attributes listed here, AromaLoc had improved values. So improving aroma concentration in the wine translates into better tasting wine. Now, this started in 2012 with a prototype machine screwed to a piece of plywood and to prove the concept worked. And then in 2016, we came up with our first machine, which some of the winemakers in the Okanagan have actually used back then in trials. And it was a roll-in type of machine that was connected to the tank's headspace by a long tube. And finally, we're at the stage where we've changed virtually everything inside the AromaLoc machine, and it's come down to a box that's 1 foot square by 8 inches deep, and it mounts directly to the tri-clamp connection on top of the tank. So that's basically the story of AromaLoc and how it works. I'll let Randy take it over from here. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Dick. Well, folks, there you go. In a nutshell, as Dr. Jones has just explained, that conundrum that winemakers have faced for centuries, i.e. how to preserve desirable aromas during and after fermentation, is now being met by AromaLoc. And the good news is that the result of the work that Dick and his colleagues have carried out over the past several years has now culminated in the availability of commercial AromaLoc models. So if you are a winery, if you're a winemaker, and what you've just heard sounds intriguing, we invite you to visit our website at AromaLoc, that's aromaloc.com. Have a look, and then contact us for purchasing information or with any questions you may have. If you'd like to write directly to Dick, he can be reached at dick@aromaloc.com. If you have questions about the models that are available, pricing, etc., you can contact walter@aromaloc.com. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.